Good morning. Nearly 50 years ago, which is a long time ago, as I was entering medical school, I never could have envisioned myself here. Never. I entered as a Christian and became very involved in Christian Medical and Dental Association, as we called it back then. But like so many things in life, we have no idea what the Lord has in store for us and how He will open the door. So it's a great joy to be on that journey. I encourage you, if you have some reservation about the path that God has for you, just show up, right? Just show up. The Holy Spirit will lead you and guide you into places that you never thought you might be. Several years ago, Dr. David Stevens, who at the time was head of ICMDA in the United States, said to me, "Gene, why don't you go back to school and study ethics?" I looked at him, and I'm a very plain speaker in the United States. I'm from a city called Detroit. We are not fancy people. We are just noun, verb, dative, object. We're really straightforward. And I looked at him and I said, "David, I'm not ethical." Okay, well, maybe that sounded wrong. And I said, no, people that study ethics, they're high-minded. They think a lot of big thoughts and deep thoughts, and I'm noun, verb, dative, object. Like, if heart stops, restart heart, right? I am that kind of doctor. And I said, I don't think that's really my calling in this genre of medicine. But, as God would have it, there were many opportunities in the real practice of medicine where God challenged my ethics, caused me to reflect, caused me to ask what He was doing in all of that. You know, I thought at first, I should be a missionary doctor. I had some close friends and family that were serving in Papua New Guinea. I went twice. I hate snakes. I don't like bugs. I don't like it where the temperature's 105. I don't like it where people shoot you with spears. You know, there was nothing out of that whole experience. And I would stand out there kind of in the field, I don't know, either waiting for the rapture or the second coming. And at the end, I realized this is not for me, right? I even tried one other attempt. I went to Haiti. I took a team. Right? Our beloved pastor was sharing, sometimes we think as doctors we can do it all. I think that a lot. And every time God pulls a rug out from under me and shows me. I got sick as a dog. I laid there for about a week, puking my brains out and having a deep conversation with God. And I said, I promise you, I will be a sender, but I'm not going to be a goer, right? Give me the checkbook and I'll get folks there. But again, in God's way, you'll hear in some of the story the different places that he took us. And I think, as you've had several take-home points in your message, there's a few. And one is show up, right, and leave the rest to God. And He will open and close doors as He sees fit. So let me start with this little girl. Not her real picture, and I won't use her real name. I'll call her Fiona, because everybody knows the movie Shrek, and Fiona had red hair. Yeah, see, you're going to figure out I am not deep. If you have to think extra hard to think where I'm going, you have gone right through me. Okay, so you're going to come home and put on the evaluation. The lady talked about Shrek in the first few minutes, right? So Fiona came into our hospital looking like this. The last time I saw Fiona, she looked like this. And I was standing there in the midst of it. What happened from that first picture to the second was a story that many of us who've worked in the ICU might recognize. She came in with what looked like a viral pneumonia. It got worse. She ended up on the ventilator. I felt your pain today of the story of one ventilator and knowing what difficulty that might present. She then ended up on ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, as you saw in that picture. Now let me do a little aside. That's a long way from being a missionary in Papua New Guinea to standing next to all that equipment and yet that's where God put me. The bridge to transplant was uncertain in those days. We were one of the first centers to be very aggressive about ECMO for children, and so we were debating, should we continue support or should we wait? Could we wait on a donor? The machine gave us all sorts of feedback, but the machine could not tell us what was right. And I think probably like my brother dealing with a broken ventilator, you sort of look around and you think, I wish the attending would show up, right, and tell me what to do. And then you go, oh, I am the attending, right? That's kind of scary. And in her situation, we could actually lighten the anesthesia and we could talk to her. And that just really gripped my heart. We talked with the family. We felt that bridge to transplant was not an option. And we said goodbye to her and to her family on that machine. I've had a lot of children come through my life, a lot that have died, because PEDS ICU is filled with that. There's probably 24 stories I remember, and 24 situations, and hers haunts me because she was alive and vibrant, and then we had to turn the machine off. I looked around then for people for wisdom. Frankly, when I went to my church, and I went to a really solid church, but it just went over. In fact, for the pastors in the room, frankly, I kind of dreaded when you came into my heart of the hospital because I didn't think you got it. I didn't think you understood how hard this was. It's interesting. We live in a time of paradox. We have the most powerful moment in the history of modern medicine, and yet here we are gathered under a theme of brokenness. We have healthcare that can advance things like that girl's ECMO, and then we have people in low resource environments that struggle to get vaccines, to get simple surgeries, to get prenatal care. So it's very clear that no technology has ended our broken state. And some of the hardest questions, like that one with Fiona, are created by the very tools that were meant to heal. So the theme of this is just because we can, should we? I know early on in my residency at Emory, we had a very smart pediatric cardiologist, and he would sit down in front of the parents and he'd say, we've tried this procedure and this procedure and this procedure, and they've all failed. This is the last thing we can try. I wasn't trained in ethics. I wasn't knowledgeable. In fact, we didn't talk that much about ethics back then in bioethics. But something in my spirit said, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. And I felt he was emotionally manipulating that family by that. In fact, I've seen that replay over and over and over. I watched a dear uncle of mine die from a rare leukemia, and they kept pumping him full of platelets and full of blood products. But nobody came and said to my aunt, this is the end. This is not going to turn around. Weeks after his funeral, she came to me and she said, couldn't the doctors tell? And I sort of embarrassedly said, yeah, they could tell. She said, then why didn't they give stopping as an option? Technology is great. I love gizmos. I love widgets. I love Lego. I love things that you assemble. The bigger the challenge, the more I love it. I would have been on that team building the wall with my father. I would have said, give me a power drill. I want to do this, which is not surprising for an anesthesiologist and ICU doc. But the technology is a gift. It is not the savior. And I use that word intentionally because sometimes we get so caught up with what we know medically, we think that will provide the saving grace. And yet we know on a different level, there's only one saving grace. Little history lesson here. In the 1800s, there was a gentleman named Mr. Ludd. His picture there kind of looks like he's in a dress or some sort of costume. There was no Instagram then. Otherwise, it would be at Luddite.com or something like that. But this is an actual drawing of him. And he was upset because his village, which was a textile town, was being invaded with the Industrial Revolution. And he organized his town to push back so that industry, so factories, so automation would not come. So you may have heard the phrase, oh, there's such a Luddite, right? We carried it forward into the United States when typewriters came around and stenographers lost their jobs. Now don't go back home to North Carolina and tell my team this, okay? But I have some Luddites on my staff. They are AI Luddites. They have a holier than thou that I don't use AI. And I'm like, well, you go, right? You waste all that time however you want to. I'm going to use it, and later on in one of the special interest groups, we'll talk about it. So there's even a group now that says, join the movement to pause AI. Really? Really? I mean, that's like pausing the tsunami. Ethical use of it, we'll talk later, but really. So instead of being a Luddite, let's embrace the gift, the gifts, the technology that God has given us. I love being a creative. I've spent the last really 10 years of my life being a chief innovation officer, and I love to build something out of nothing. I love creativity. I think when I do that, I feel like I bear the reflection of God, the ultimate creator. And I think I show up and participate with what God has planned, right? Because I'm helping him, that sounds wrong, I am helping move that forward, right, by using the creativity he's given me. I'll show some examples later about how to do that. So I don't shy away from technology. I don't shy away from innovation. In fact, I'm probably one of those people you call an early adopter. I'm on the leading, bleeding edge. I will also say, if you're like me, you will fail a lot. And people will laugh at you, and they will go, oh no, here she comes. But like so many things, you said that Hudson Taylor said we had to be willing to do that, right? For the kingdom's sake, we have to do that for technology as well. Well, there is some good news for the broken when it comes to technology, and I'm going to focus on 4 areas: AI, genomics, telemedicine, and surgery. You could pick any number. So this is on the quiz for all the med students, right? Please redraw this on the back of your name tag. No, just kidding. CF, cystic fibrosis modulators, or transfer receptors. The world of cystic fibrosis, one of the most common inherited diseases, has been radically changed because we now have medications that can change this malformed protein that the child inherited into a protein that now works and moves sodium and chloride back and forth. Somebody at my church one day saw that on my phone case it said COPD, and they said, oh, is that like cystic fibrosis for grown-ups? And I said, well, sort of, kind of loosely. And I said, why'd you ask? And they said, because our son, and then they hesitated, and they went, I guess you say had cystic fibrosis. He went on one of these drugs. He went from multiple treatments a day, multiple chest percussions, multiple antibiotics, to none of that. They said if you saw him walk in, you would think there is nothing wrong with this kid. So this is exciting that we have this, right? And please draw this next to the word CFTR, right? I love all the new pictures now that you can see. I'm just kidding about that. So here's a picture of the modulator and the protein. The next thing I put out for you to think about is, okay, I can handle the advances of CFTR. What about gene editing for sickle cell? I remember about 25 years ago when the first bone marrow transplant was done at our hospital for a child with sickle cell. And having grown up in Detroit and then practiced in the South, I've seen a lot of patients with sickle cell. And I see the painful vaso-occlusive crisis, and I see the limiting of blood flow to their brain and their limited stature. And I see this and I go, wow, This is even better than a bone marrow transplant. You could get to the patient sooner, you could stop the pain, you could stop often what leads to narcotic addiction. You know, I get really excited about this. And then we move to the slippery slope. What about the child with Down syndrome? I'm old enough, and there's a few doctors in the room that are old enough. We used to see a lot of children with Down syndrome. We don't see them anymore because of selective abortion, because of IVF, because parents pick out the embryo that they want implanted. How do you have this conversation? How do you talk to people about this? What prepares you for that dialogue? And I guess, maybe my second Cliff Notes or Spark Notes theme is get in a community, right? Of fellow doctors and dentists where you can safely talk about these sorts of things. The public will not be able to go there with you. They won't understand it, but get with those that can wrestle with you on the science. Now, a friend of mine, we were both analytic geeks at our hospital. Like, give me a big data set and leave me alone for about 3 days, and I am really a happy camper. And he took a big data set and he looked at it because his dad had a genetic form of kidney disease. So he took our government's Medicare data set and looked, what variable makes a difference in the outcome? And he ran the numbers. I think of it sometimes as putting fruits and vegetables in a blender, right? And out comes a wonderful smoothie on the other side. Well, in his smoothie, it showed him the patients who were very thin, like had a BMI like 19, actually lived much longer. And every year or so, I run into him at a geeky analytic meeting, and there he is, very skinny, but still alive. See, because the data meant something to him, and he knew that there was something impactable that he could do. I love that. I love that when the data gives you insight. But maybe the data has given you some insight, like the patient in front of you has the genes for Parkinson's or Huntington's or Alzheimer's. Now that you know that, what do you do? When do you talk to them about it? When do you bring it up in conversation? And if there is no treatment right now, should you even bring it up? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I was talking to my own internist this week about it, and I said, I'm really befuddled about some of these genetic markers that are showing up. They can frighten patients because, you know from genetics class, just because you have the gene doesn't mean you express it, but the lay public doesn't understand that. They don't understand epigenetics and everything else that goes with it. But to me, these right here are the examples of really tough situations. Now, I do like to use AI, I confess. If you want to stone me outside, like, or Joan of Arc, go ahead. But I love it for chronic disease detection. In 2010, I got a big NIH grant, and the construct was use this grant money to find patients with chronic disease, this was in North Carolina, who don't know they have it, and then manage them. And I was like a kid in a candy store. I was like, this is so cool. In fact, it's honestly how I got into COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Because remember, the beginning story, I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist, but my research has always been using data. And so I had this big data set, and I started to find patients who didn't know they had the disease. I found people that were highly likely to be readmitted to the hospital, and we could get to them and intervene and get them better care and decrease their hospital admission and readmission. So that was NIH funding research. Now we're 15 years down the pipeline, and commercial products are out there. I should have put a disclosure at the beginning of this. I'm not paid by any company. I don't represent any medical device. But I do have some that I'm really interested in watching. And I think this one, which came out of Stanford, is really interesting. And I think the ways that we can scale things and look at patients at a whole are really pretty exciting. This is some early work that Viz.AI did where if a patient comes in and it looks like they've either clotted off a major vessel or had a stroke, they can do the scan and get the message to the radiologist without 15 handoffs in between, and the interventional radiologist shows up in the suite. And I know many of your hospitals measure door to stent time for cardiovascular disease, but now we have it for vascular disease, brain vascular disease. We say time is brain, right? The quicker we can get somebody in, the better. And the fewer handoffs, the better. There's some things I think show real promise for the low resource world, and I think that's the whole world of remote telemonitoring. For the longest time, after adopting my children, in fact, I'm very proud to introduce Hudson Taylor. I know you thought he was dead. He's not. He's here. He's on the front row. So this is Hudson Taylor Wright, my oldest son, yes, who's dutifully, yeah, you could applaud him if you'd like, yeah. And I'll totally embarrass him, right? But, you know, when your mom gives you a name like that, there's kind of expectations, right? You know, I didn't name him LeBron James for a reason. But I think remote has such opportunity. So from his older sister's orphanage, I was able to run clinic about once a week and see the kids. This was an orphanage outside of Beijing for medically and surgically needy children. And it was when we had Skype. Nobody remembers Skype, right? It's before we had FaceTime and Teams and everything else. But what we could do remotely was amazing. You know, this happens to be a platform for managing patients with chronic care. It can scale on a dime. Yes, creating it takes money, effort, but then scaling it is where the beauty is. And in fact, I would say some of the low resource world is much more willing to jump into this than the US. I was with a hospital that actually embraced going virtual. In fact, we used to say, go virtual or go home. So we just leaned into it. And the good news is we got into it before COVID. So when COVID hit, we were prepared. And so we have ICUs that are virtual. We can oversee much of the state. We have school and community-based clinics. I was very pleased to be involved in a project where we screen every patient that comes for a primary care visit with a GAD-7 and a PHQ-9. And then we pull out those with an elevated score, and we connect them. I kind of point to wherever the cloud is, right? I still haven't figured out where the cloud is, but where the cloud is, we connect them through the cloud to psychologists for med refills, for hospitalizations, and it really became a leading program. Even during COVID, when hospital beds were so short, I don't know about your country, but and especially the big cities, patients were backed up in the ER, tents were put outside the building. We were able to manage 8,400 patients in their home, not with like home health after discharge, but the exact same care, everything short of the ventilator for their COVID. And it was really exciting. I think these kind of programs hold great opportunity. This technology is exciting for all parts of the world. So this is a picture in our virtual ICU. We can tell when people are getting septic and say, hey, that person over there, they've met the criteria, or that person there. So these little hospitals in North Carolina that may not even have a doctor in the building at night get the same level of care as if they were in Charlotte. And if you're like me, your stream brings in some interesting stories. Like this one came in just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, June 17th. A surgical robot just completed an operation with almost total autonomy. 0 human intervention. That's amazing. Now, some of you already figured out I do have kind of an odd sense of humor. I wanted to know whose playlist was playing in that OR, right? Did the robot get to pick the music, or did this, you know, yeah, just ask. Asking for a friend, right? That's pretty exciting when you can offer that at distance. And Hudson's sister, Emily, she's actually a pre-med, and she's doing her summer research this summer. I keep saying to her, embrace AI, embrace big data, and embrace virtual. And for some of you, being an embracer of technology gives you a passport to part of the world. So there was a time in the early 80s that I got a call by a cardiac surgeon. Pastor Fung and I spoke about him this morning, and he said, I'm looking for an anesthesiologist. And I had put my name in with Interserve and tent makers and said, I'm single, I don't have children, I have nothing to tie me down. I would like to go to a difficult place. And he called and said, we're going to take a team, and I need someone that can do cardiac anesthesia, right? And we would go for a month at a time. And those of you from Australia, you may know Dr. Clifford Hughes. I did anesthesia for him many, many times, and just a phenomenal cardiac surgeon. We were in a large town at one point, and I was very frustrated because there were so many things in front of us that we could have done differently, but the culture in that OR, the hierarchy was stopping it. In fact, I looked at Dr. Ho and I said, I think this is a waste, right? I think it's an absolute waste. I wouldn't come back here next year. I think we ought to, like Paul says, shake the dust, go to another city where they want to work for us. Jonathan knew better, and the next year we came back to the same place. Now me, kind of being a bit of a cynic and a pessimist, didn't expect much. And they came running out to greet me at the train, and they had this book in their hand. It's never going to be made into a movie, all right? It's called Pediatric Cardiac Anesthesia. And I have a small chapter in it. And they said, Dr. Jean, while you were gone this year, we did the book. We did the book. We want you to see what we did. They took the book, and for that entire year, they went chapter by chapter by chapter and revolutionized the care for those patients. I was so humbled and so broken. I was so short-sighted about what God could do in that moment, right? I thought I was there just for the technology and the blood and the machines, and here God was working on such a different level. I do want to shift us to maybe 3 temptations that come with using technology. One, I often hear it said that you're tempted to play God if you're gene editing, if you're selecting embryos. What about all the embryos that are made, that are frozen? Those are tough questions. And I find most of the church, and frankly, most of my doctor friends, don't really engage in that conversation. And they back away from it almost because it's easier to avoid it than to embrace it. We are the creatures. We are not the creator. My favorite verses here that I've often used, especially in talking with families facing their child's life, I'd put Deuteronomy 32:39. See now that I myself am he, there is no God beside me. I put to death and I bring to life. I've wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand. Years ago, I'd taken a whole bunch of data, and I was trying to predict who would live and who would die, and who needed ECMO. And right across from Emory's med school is Emory's School of Business. And my institution actually paid me to go to business school. I say it's like Moses got his education at Pharaoh's expense. So here I am, sitting in business school, clueless, okay? I had no idea what they were talking about 99% of the time. But we got into predictive models. They were talking about the stock market and businesses, and I was trying to figure out live, die. And I took my data to the professor, and I said, I'm really confused. And he looked down at it. He messed with it a little bit, and he said, you have really messy data. I said, thank you. Welcome to clinical medicine. And he said, well, what do I mean by that? You have people that died that all intents and purposes should have lived. And you have people that live that all intents and purposes should have died. Yes. And that's the space that we live in. And, my only peace or comfort in that is to do whatever I can do with whatever God has given me to do and leave the results to him. I never want to do a half job. My kids hear me say that all the time. Was it a half job? Did you take the garbage out, or did you own, that's getting a little too personal there, just struck a nerve, right? 20 years, you'd think you'd figure out what Wednesday night is. So tonight is garbage night for us, right? But it's not black and white. And I've had kids that I went out and told their family, you brought your child with meningococcemia at just the right time. We got the antibiotics started, and I'd walk back in the room, and as we say in the South, the kid would up and die. Number two, the temptation is to reduce the person. I think that's easy for people like me that spend a lot of time in the data. We forget that behind every single one of those data points is an image bearer, right? The image of God. It's not a rounding error. It's not an outlier. My kids recently were involved in a study at their college where they were measuring lung function on college students. There were some real outliers. And I feel like, man, I need to make a call with each one of them because they are a person, and this is their life, and it's going to be really affected. So how do I balance what I can do in a low-resource environment with what I could do somewhere else? Many of you who've gone back and forth from those environments, you have a hard time. I remember the first time I came back from working in Southeast Asia, and I walked into the ICU, and they were doing CPR on this child, and I think he'd had his mitral valve replaced 3 times, and I thought, I just don't think I can do this again. I just can't come to grips with it. And the shock as you go back and forth. I almost wish every med student or every resident had to do an overseas rotation, especially if you come from a Western country. So you see, like I saw patients in Papua New Guinea that only could get 2 liters of nasal oxygen. If you needed more, right, then you are now in line for the next admission to heaven, right? Number 3, replace presence. This would be, I guess, my third take-home point that's woven through this. I'm not sure those people standing around Fiona's bed remember all that equipment and all those monitors, but I think they remember the conversations we've had. I grew up in a time where we actually could pray publicly over patients. It's gotten very tough in the United States to do that now. But where you could, really bond together with the Spirit and praying for that child and ushering that child into the kingdom. They will forget the diagnosis. They will never forget whether you were with them. So let's close with some principles that you already know. These are those high-minded things that David Stevens and other ethicists talk about. Autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Are we treating patients as in a covenantal relationship? Are we showing the respect for them as an individual? Do we realize that we're taking the Holy Spirit with us every time we move in? And are we comfortable? Do we make space? Do we make time for the least of these? Anytime you look at a new tool, here's a half a dozen questions you can ask yourself. Does this serve the person or use the person? If you're used to IRBs, they ask that a lot. Who benefits and who's left out? Does it deepen or diminish the human relationship? Does it respect dignity and finitude, or does it try to escape them? And is it making me a more loving physician or just a more efficient technician? The capability, the ability to replicate these things on scale now is cheap. It's wisdom. It's that being connected to the patient that's such a scarce resource. So we are called to build the kingdom among the broken, remembering that Jesus healed with the simplest tools, right? Touch, spit, oil, mud. I've often said to families, for God to do a miracle, he doesn't need all this. He may choose to use it at some point, but when the Good Samaritan stopped and helped to bind the wounds, right? He didn't put the patient on ECMO, right? I think a lot of times when I send out a team of 2 situations where Jesus gave instructions, and it makes me realize, just as Jesus gave case-by-case instructions, I need to do the same. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when he sends them out early in the ministry, he says, do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in the belts, no bag for the journey or extra shirt or sandals, for the worker's worth of his keep. He wants them to be totally reliant on God and realize you don't need those things. But later, as he gets closer to the crucifixion, he gives them different instructions. He says to them, but now if you have a purse, take it, a bag, and if you don't have a sword, right, go to Amazon and download and sell your cloak and buy one, just making sure you're paying attention, all right? Why did he give different instructions? Because they were different times. I have used this so many times in taking teams with me, because they'll say, are we going to take Bibles? Let's pray about it. Are we going to take medicines? Are we going to take stuff to do surgery? Are we going to go visit pastors in difficult spots? We're going to pray, and we're going to see where the Holy Spirit is leading us. Let me close with this. Remember I told you about Fiona? That story, that ending, was different in 1982 than perhaps these authors who literally just published this year. For me, it's that playing through of God's sending the disciples out with stuff and without stuff, right? The answer to Fiona this year may be different than the answer in the past. So as you approach the situations, the difficult callings, the challenging ethical cases, stop. The Holy Spirit's standing there with you in the room, willing to make his will clear to you. Stop and listen. What is it that you have for this patient at this moment? With technology or without? With a prolongation of life or with congratulating them on finishing well? So the algorithm for that little girl was right, and she did not survive, right? But a young doctor pulls a chair to the bedside so that no one would face the end alone. The technology gave the truth, but love decided what to do with it. You be the master of the machines. You be the master of the technology, but you bring the kingdom with you into that environment every time. Thank you.